Welcome to part two of this tour of the Grateful Dead concert poster exhibition running at the Narrows Center through April 1, 2023. Now, one attendee at the Trips Festival in January 1966 was young graphic designer and printer Wes Wilson. Wilson, born in Sacramento in 1937, attended the Trips Festival and was greatly changed by the event. Over time, he and the other poster artists tried to reflect the intensity of the psychedelic experience with their evolving style. Wes Wilson did almost all of the posters advertising rock dances in the first half of 1966 and is generally credited as the father of the psychedelic poster. At first, in the early spring of 1966, Chet Helms's family dog and Bill Graham shared use of the Fillmore, each running dance concerts alternating every other weekend. Helms and Graham had much different styles, with Graham being the hard-nosed businessman and Chet Helms being the more altruistic, stoned, and loose hippie promoter, kind of just like his audiences. Here's a family dog poster by Wes Wilson for a show at the Fillmore in March 1966 that was produced by the family dog. But Bill Graham did not like to share, and soon after the event shown here occurred, he cut an exclusive deal with the owner of the Fillmore, and Helms was out. When Helms complained, Graham told him to get up earlier in the morning. Well, we're not sure that Helms actually was getting up earlier in the morning, but he did move the family dog events over to the Avalon Ballroom. And here's the first one in April of 1966. Poster also by Wes Wilson. Wilson's lettering began to shimmer and pulsate, to fill every space and mimic the psychedelic experience that was happening inside the ballrooms. This poster was from May 1966, and along the bottom of this and each poster were a ticket strip telling people where they could buy tickets. It's important to remember that these posters were advertising. They were not created as art, but they were working field animals out in the fields, pulling the plow, trying to drum up sales of tickets. FM radio barely existed, and newspapers paid little attention to rock and roll in 1966, and so posters were how tickets were sold. Now, the Grateful Dead had spent a few early spring months in Los Angeles with their benefactor and LSD manufacturer, Owsley Stanley, and they were now living in Marin County at Rancho Olampali and later Camp Lagunitas. This Wes Wilson poster from early June 1966 was one of the earliest posters featuring the Dead after they returned from LA. From now on, all the posters you see are in the exhibition, but I'm going to continue to talk about some of the poster design concepts and artists, and we are going to follow the Dead roughly chronologically. Chet Helms used to suggest themes for his events to his poster designers. For this concert featuring the Grateful Dead and Quicksilver Messenger Service, he suggested The Quick and the Dead. Wilson ran with it. The central image is by a Mexican artist, Jose Posada. It's a Day of the Dead character, rather dapper, and all ready to go to the show. You will notice that the skull actually began with a thumbprint. This is a very rare poster, and we have a second printing in the exhibition. Graham and Helms were producing shows weekly, and it was a bit much for Wilson doing both posters. He preferred the creative freedom that Bill Graham gave him, and so he quit working for Chet Helms. We're going to continue with Wes Wilson for a while, and then we're going to come back to mid-1966. Early July 1966. Incredible lineups here, including the band Love, up from Los Angeles. The Grateful Dead July 3rd, 1966 show exists on tape and is played from time to time on the Sirius XM Grateful Dead channel. As Wilson searched for inspiration, he came across the works of Alfred Roller. Here is Roller's poster for an exhibition of the Vienna Secessionist artists from 1903. The Vienna Secessionists were the Austrian version of the Art Nouveau movement going on all over Europe at that time. Wilson loved the lettering style and decided to play around with it. His version of this alphabet later became part of his signature style. Let's take a closer look. The lettering is basically identical rectangular blocks with little directional cuts in them, defining the character of each letter. The effect is to obfuscate the letters, making them difficult to make out. This was the opposite of the straightforward rules of advertising design from the boxing style period. This mid-August 1966 Wes Wilson poster is the first time he used the roller alphabet, and also the first time that photos of the bands were used in a poster. These photos were both by Herb Green, and you'll notice Signa Anderson in the Jefferson Airplane photo, as Grace Slick was a few months away from replacing her. An amazing Labor Day weekend in 1966. This was the first time Wes Wilson used a nude in his posters, and it would hardly be the last. This was around the time the Dead moved into 710 Ashbury Street in The Haight. Here is a wonderful Wes Wilson piece showcasing the roller-inspired alphabet and a beardless Jerry Garcia. The ornamentation along the sides is also influenced by Art Nouveau, in particular Aubrey Beardsley in this piece. Now, even though the posters were advertisements, plain and simple, a curious thing was happening. People were ripping the posters off telephone poles and retrieving them from store windows and putting them up on their walls. They were walking into poster stores asking for last week's concert poster. Eventually, one of the poster store owners, Ben Friedman, found his way to Bill Graham and bought out his supply of leftover posters. And then he asked Graham to increase the press runs and sell him the extras. Later, Ben Friedman did the same deal with Chet Helms for posters from the Avalon, and this is why a fair number of these posters do exist today in pretty good shape. This December 1966 poster advertises Otis Redding with several different opening acts, including the Grateful Dead, who played with him at the Tuesday show. Meanwhile, a curious situation had developed. After the concerts were over, the hippies were in no hurry to leave the venue. What are you talking about? I'm still tripping my face off. They're like hanging around and going nowhere. So Bill Graham began offering next week's concert poster to the first 500 people who would leave the building. 1966 becomes 1967. The first of the New Year's shows where Bill Graham served breakfast. Now, the posters were made as work-for-hire projects, meaning that the artist did the work for a specific sum, and that's all. The copyright and the use of the poster thereafter were controlled by the promoter, and this became a dispute between the poster artists, particularly Wes Wilson and Bill Graham, because now that Bill Graham was selling their work as art, then the artists felt that they should get some sort of royalty. Here's a very psychedelic poster from January 1967. It features the Grateful Dead and the Doors with bluesman Junior Wells. The Dead and the Doors didn't really get along that well, but in these days, rock and roll was exploding so fast and was so new that promoters just slapped bills together and saw what stuck. Bill Graham actually took pride in exposing the kids to other kinds of music. February 1967, a classic Wes Wilson design. One of the differences between these posters and the posters that you buy today at a Phish show is that none of these had the year in them. In the 60s, the posters were advertising the concerts coming up next week. Everyone knew what year it was. The souvenir poster one might buy at a show today always has the year, because they are being created as art to commemorate the event, not advertising. March 1967. Another interesting difference between today's posters and the 1960s posters is that back then, the bands had no involvement in the posters advertising their shows. The promoter hired a graphic designer, and the bands had nothing to do with it. And yet, one more hallmark of the psychedelic style was that often the images had nothing to do with the bands. How do you advertise Chuck Berry and the Grateful Dead in this March 1967 concert? With a nude and a snake, of course. This poster from May 1967 is what I refer to as Wes Wilson's last stand. Wes Wilson's attempt to get paid fairly for the work-for-hire posters that Bill Graham was now selling as art came to a head, And when Graham continued to refuse compromise, Wilson made this Grateful Dead poster showing a hungry pregnant woman, Wilson's wife, Ava, and a huge greedy snake with a $sign in its mouth, and even a small stylized swastika in the serpent's nose. Given that Graham had fled the Holocaust as a boy, well, this was the last poster Wilson would do for Bill Graham for several years. To continue with our tour, it's time to start part 3.